Welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Andrew Holland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. I, of course, am your host, Andrew Holland, and I'm excited for today's episode because we're going to continue where we left off from last episode, the phone call, where I had just introduced you to the idea of the business that Jeff and I were going to get into. Today, we're going to talk about year one of that business, a lot of the struggles we went through, what we learned, and that's going to dovetail nicely into what we want to conclude the podcast with, and that is, what are the considerations that an individual needs to take when they're thinking about becoming an entrepreneur or when they're thinking about starting a business? Now, if you're listening to this and you already own a business, and again, we define a business owner from a broad perspective. Perhaps you're in an organization and you're responsible for running a department. Doesn't matter whether you're in a small, medium, or large business. Perhaps you're in an executive position in a public company. A lot of the considerations and a lot of the decisions you have to make, whether you technically own the business or not, are the same as if you actually own the business. So what this is going to dovetail into is, what are the considerations you need to make or think about when you want to become an entrepreneur? Should you become an entrepreneur? Should you start a business? And again, relevant to people who are already in business, because the considerations and assessments you should be making or taking when you're thinking about becoming a business owner or moving into entrepreneurship are just as relevant in your 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 of an existing business as they are prior to starting the business. You always want to have a feedback loop or an assessment process where you're thinking through some of the things we're going to be talking about. It's also relevant if you're thinking about adding a product line, or you're thinking about buying another business that complements the business you currently have very well, or starting another segment. So this podcast, as all our podcasts are, is for anyone that's thinking about becoming an entrepreneur and anybody that's currently a business owner or entrepreneur, again, taking the broad definition of a business owner. As I promised in the previous podcast, we have to start all of these with the obligatory disclaimer. This is a podcast about business, economics. We discuss all ranges of topics. I'm a CPA, and so we often talk about the financial side of business because that's so crucial to the success of any business. We also talk about things that pop up from a legal perspective in business. What I don't want to have happen is you hear something on this podcast and you take it as the gospel truth, apply it to a particular circumstance that you have, and it doesn't go well, and then you want to sue me. Please don't do that. You should never take anything you hear on any podcast and apply it to your circumstance without talking to the appropriate professionals in your particular location or your industry. You just shouldn't take it from a podcast. You want to make sure you're getting the best advice that's relevant to you. Now that we've gone through that disclaimer, we'll have that at the beginning of every disclaimer or every podcast, just to be on the safe side, which, as you'll learn in business, being sure that you're being mindful of liability is important. Let's talk about and continue the conversation that we were having about the roll-off company that Jeff and I were starting. You'll find throughout all these podcasts that you're going to learn a little bit more about my background and the struggles that Jeff and I went through and some of the other businesses that I started in each podcast. And as I said in the previous podcast, if we tried to cover it all in one podcast, it would take hours and weeks and years, just like any business owner story does. I talked about that in episode 1 in the phone call. We talked about watching documentaries and they make everything look so easy and boom, it just happens overnight. Of course, that's not the case. And I don't want this podcast to indicate that the success that we've had happened overnight, because no success happens overnight, no lasting success. So if you recall, Jeff had called me. I was working as a CPA in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis specifically, which is in the Midwest, Minnesota. He was working as a pilot in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, our hometown, where we ultimately started the roll-off company, ProViral. We called it Proviro Waste Services. We would eventually get into residential and commercial services, but we'll talk about how we went through that path or got to that ultimate decision. But we started as a roll-off company. Those are those big dumpsters that you typically see on construction sites, or that you might get if your house is really messy and you're moving and you need a 10-yard or a 15-yard or a 20-yard or a 30-yard to get rid of all your junk. We had done a lot of research and due diligence, or what we thought was the appropriate research or due diligence to get into this industry. Looking back, we really didn't have a clue what we were doing. The reality was we were young. As I had indicated, we started at 23, 24. We were just excited to be entrepreneurs. We had no clue what we were doing. I was white collar, really had no business getting into a blue collar industry. Jeff was really white collar as well, flying a private jet. People would, of course, charter the jet. He would fly them to the appropriate destination, wait, and then fly them back. Much more white collar than it is blue collar. And here we're thinking about getting into a relatively dirty blue collar industry. And so that's relevant because we'll talk about some of the considerations you should take and some of the assessments you should do that we didn't do. And we paid dearly for that prior to jumping into any business or getting into any segment. The particular industry that we chose is very capital intensive. That means it requires a lot of money to start because you got to buy the dumpsters. And those are $4,000 to $5,000 per dumpster right off the bat. And you can't just have one. You can't just have two. You really need probably a minimum of 10. And then you need the truck. And if you're going to get a new truck, that's upwards of $20,000 or $200,000. Of course, we couldn't afford that. I didn't come from money. Jeff didn't come from money. We didn't have anybody that had money around us. And so you would think one of the first things, a logical thing you would say is, okay, we want to get into this industry, the waste management industry. Is this an industry that's compatible with our wallets? Well, the true answer was no. But we didn't let that stop us. So how did we finance it? And as we'll talk about in future podcasts, one of the biggest things you need to think about when you're choosing a business to start or an industry to go into or a segment to start or a business to buy is the financial aspect. I think that goes without saying, but we didn't really think that much about it because we were pretty naive. So how did we finance this? Well, this was 2010. And the good thing for us was asset prices were relatively inexpensive. If you remember, we had the great financial crisis in 2008. And so that had a huge impact on the construction industry. Sadly, home prices had been decimated. And what gets hurt, of course, in that scenario is new home building, remodels, the construction industry. So there are a lot of entities across the United States that were going bankrupt and were trying to sell their assets because they had either gone into receivership, someone had taken them over, they either gone bankrupt, so the bank was trying to sell them. And so we started researching throughout the country to figure out where can we get roll-off dumpsters and a truck. Eventually, we found a company out of Florida. And if you recall, and maybe you weren't around that time, but some of the areas that were most hit or hit the hardest during the great financial crisis were Florida and Arizona. So there was a roll-off company or a construction company that was essentially going bankrupt. And they had a truck and 18 dumpsters that they were trying to get rid of for a total of $80,000. Now, that's a really, really, really good deal for us. Because as I indicated, a new truck would be upwards of $200,000. Of course, you don't start off with new equipment if you don't have the money, and new dumpsters would be $4,000 to $5,000. There's a benefit to starting off with new equipment, but you don't always have the benefit or the capital of buying new. So we had to pretty much buy anything that we could afford, and we couldn't really even afford $80,000, but it was the only thing that we could find, and we were determined to get this started. So I had recognized from a very early age, 14, 15, that credit was going to be important to me at some point in time. I didn't know exactly when it would be important, but I knew it would be important. Credit, the concept of a credit score, is something that a financial institution looks at or a credit card company looks at to determine the probability that you will repay an obligation that they give to you. So we could talk or have a whole episode on credit. And again, I recognize for some of those, for some of you who are perhaps been through this process, credit is something you know very well aware. For those of you who bear with us, for those of you who don't know what credit is, we could have a whole episode on that, and perhaps we will, but there are a lot of great resources out there that talk about how do you build your credit score, why is credit important, what should you be doing to ensure that when you want to buy a house or you want to finance a business or you need a credit card or you need a higher limit on the credit card, you're going to be able to do so. So I had known from an early age that credit was going to be important. Again, as I indicated, I didn't know why. So I had actively, it didn't just happen, I actively worked on building my credit score from 14 and up. So by the time I got to 22 or 23, I had multiple credit cards. None of them had a balance. And they all had very high limits. What that means is I had a credit card that had a $40,000 limit. I had another credit card that had a $25,000 limit. And so I had the ability to draw on those at any point in time up to that credit limit. Now, I would never recommend financing a business this way. But as I indicated, we didn't have any other option, and we were determined to start this. So I took out $40,000 on a credit card. Now, I didn't just take it out on the credit card. If you've had a credit card before, you often get balance transfer offers in the mail for these credit cards, where you can pay 3% up front or 4% up front or 5% up front, and you'll get 0% for 12 months or 24 months or 36 months. That's what I took advantage of. Jeff did something very similar. Now, he was in a better position because I believe in 2008, he had, or maybe the beginning of 2009, he had purchased a house. There were a lot of programs that a new home buyer could get at that time to help them buy a house because the housing market had collapsed. And the government was wanting to get it restarted, get it revamped so we could recover from the great financial crisis. Local municipalities were having deals where they would help you with the down payment. At the state level, there were often opportunities, and at the federal level. So he had taken advantage of one of those. I think those were very helpful, meaningful programs. And he took advantage of, and he had a house. So he had a house, and he put a bunch of remodeling effort and work into it. He did it all himself over a time period while he was working. And so he had some equity there. So he got, I believe, $20,000 in equity out of his home through a home equity line of credit. And then the other $20,000 he got off a credit card. He had also worked to build his credit up. So that means of financing was extremely helpful in us even being able to start this business. We will talk about financing and the appropriate ways to finance a business in future episodes. But of course, that's a big consideration whenever you're thinking about getting into business or you're operating a business. Starting with a credit card is not how I would recommend, and I eventually paid dearly for that. But nonetheless, we survived it, and that's how we got started. Now, this particular industry, and something that we didn't give consideration, was very capital intensive. And that can be a good thing, and that can be a bad thing. If you have a lot of money, that's a good thing because it's a barrier to entry, and it prevents other people from getting into that particular industry. Industries that have higher barriers of industries that have higher barriers of entry have lower competition, but they're more expensive to get into. Industries that have lower barriers to entry, and again, capital requirements is just one consideration of what would make an industry have a high or low barrier to entry. We'll talk more about that later. Industries that have a low barrier to entry are easier to get into, but there's a lot more competition. So, just like anything, there's advantages and disadvantages. This particular industry had a high barrier to entry simply because of the amount of money it required to get started. So we got our roll-off dumpster, we got our truck and our roll-off dumpsters. Now, this was about November of 2010 that we actually secured or signed the purchase agreement for the assets, but we weren't going to get them, or we asked them to hold them until February or March. Now, in Wisconsin, it's winter during February and March. It's very cold, and there's lots of snow. One of the things we didn't really think through is delivery of these dumpsters. They're not small, okay? The 10 yards are the smallest. The 30 yards are huge. So not only do you have to pay for buying the assets, we had to pay to ship them from Florida to Wisconsin, and that's no small trek. I'll talk more about what that delivery looked like. But the reason we wanted to delay getting the assets, and I was thankful that they were willing to wait to ship them, because of course there's storage costs when you maintain assets of that size. We wanted to get the business set up. We had actually already had the LLC set up because we had tried a different venture. And as opposed to paying again to set up a new LLC, we renamed it. And this was, of course, in the state of Wisconsin. And then we wanted to start thinking about the operations. How were we going to actually make this come to fruition? How were we going to have a website? So all of the pieces that are required to start a business. Not going to go through all those details right now, but things you need to think about, things that we didn't think about. And then when we actually had sent the money and we had these assets, we had to figure it out. Okay, did you really think about the revenue model? Did you think about the human capital model? Who was going to actually pick up and drop off the dumpsters? We did everything wrong. We didn't take any of the considerations that we should have. And so that should be very positive and very optimistic if you're listening to this, because we are perfect walking examples of how woefully inept, naive, and completely clueless you can be and still be successful. Now, we paid for it. When you don't take the considerations that you should, and you don't make the assessments, and you don't think about even the basic things like how are we going to actually generate revenue? How are we going to actually get customers? It becomes a lot more difficult when payments come due and you don't have any revenue to pay for them. But point being, I am a big believer in if you put your mind to wanting to accomplish something, even if you haven't made every single consideration and you haven't taken every single appropriate step, while it may make it harder, you can still be successful. So much of it starts with this: your attitude, the mind, your desire to be successful, and your commitment to making this work. Now, that can take money, that can take a lot of time, that can take a tremendous amount of patience, and it can take a tremendous amount of hardship, which can take a physical toll, which can take a mental toll. And we'll talk about all of those things you need to think about in the second half of this podcast. Those are considerations, internal assessments that you need to make. Back to the business, however. We got the dumpsters, and thankfully my parents live on about 2 acres. And when we had to get a flatbed truck, so we had to take multiple semis, and I don't remember how many semis it was, 3 or 4 semis, and those were not cheap, to ship all of the assets up here. And we got them delivered, as I said, in February or March when it was winter. Well, we really hadn't thought about how were we going to get these off the truck. And so when they arrived, we were sitting there trying to figure out how are we going to get these dumpsters off of the truck. I recognize you're probably listening to this and thinking, how stupid were you guys? Well, really stupid. But sometimes, oftentimes, and this is both personal and professional, when you're so excited about something and you have that drive and you're ready to just get started, even the most basic things you forget about in your euphoria. And that was a hard lesson. And we continue to do that. And it's so good, especially when you're young, you have that enthusiasm, but it often means you're pretty naive and you forget some of the basic factors. Now, if you're a little bit more mature in life, maybe you don't have the enthusiasm of youth, which it's good to have that enthusiasm because it gets you through a lot of the hardships. But maybe you don't have that enthusiasm of youth, but you have the maturity and experience of life, which will help you make some of these considerations so that you don't put yourself in a bind. That enthusiasm can help you get through. Point in saying that is, here we are sitting with these dumpsters on top of the truck trying to figure out how we're going to get them off. We ended up renting a lull, I believe, and trying to chain them around the dumpsters and get them off. Now, these dumpsters are heavy. And thankfully, bless my parents' heart, they were willing to let us put it in their yard. And so when we were done, after we got them all unloaded, my parents' yard was full of dumpsters. Now, the good thing, it was the winter, as I said, and so the ground was frozen. Well, we didn't really think through what would happen when the spring came and everything melted and the lawn was particularly soft. We didn't have any location to store these dumpsters. Now, you think when you start a business, okay, you need assets, you buy the assets, where are you going to put them? Nope, we hadn't figured that out yet. In addition, after we got the dumpsters taken off, there was the truck. Well, this truck was a double clutch 8-speed truck. I didn't know how to even drive a vehicle that was manual. Jeff also did not know how to drive this truck. I don't remember if he knew how to drive a manual vehicle, but this double clutch 8-speed truck, he did not know how to drive. So how are we going to get it off? Well, when it arrived, it also had a flat tire. I could go on and on about the struggles of just this one particular scenario, of all of the things that we missed and we didn't think through, but we would be here till next Christmas. So I'll make it brief. The truck arrived, flat tire, became a huge thing, and semi-drivers are great, but they don't want to sit there for 8 hours because you haven't figured out how you're going to unload the equipment that they're delivering to you. Thankfully, Jeff's dad was there. He knew how to drive the truck. I think we drove it off with a flat tire. We tried to pump it up. I don't even remember. A lot of things in business, because they're so traumatic, and this doesn't seem traumatic, but it in the moment is traumatic when you have someone sitting there and you're trying to figure out, how do I get this off? It's cold out. It's snowing. You forget for survival. We eventually got them all off. So now we have the assets, and we have to figure out, where are we going to put these assets? How are we going to actually start this business? Reality is setting in. The euphoria is washing away because we were excited, but now it came to the hard work, actually making money. We had financed it in a very expensive way, or a very challenging way, or a way that would create challenges later on, shall we say. And the euphoria was quickly wearing off, and we hadn't even started the business yet. Long story short, in this industry, you have to get licenses from the municipalities in which you want to operate. Every municipality is different. Some municipalities, it's very challenging to get a license in the waste services industry. Some municipalities, you can't, because they only give out a certain number of licenses to operate as a garbage company or a roll-off company. In our case, we, of course, hadn't done any of that research, but we knew that you needed a license. So we investigated, and thankfully, it was a miracle. We got the last license that was available in our municipality, the very last license. Now, had we not been able to get a license and the last one was taken, what would we have done? I don't know. We should have figured that out before we ordered these assets, but we didn't. Thankfully, it worked out. So we got that, and then we were ready to operate. April of 2011, we had our assets, we had our license, and we were ready to start operating. What we realized very, very quickly is the roll-off segment of the waste management services sector is very cyclical. I should say very seasonal. It's very, very profitable in the summer, but it is not profitable in the winter. Why? Because who primarily orders dumpsters? Construction companies. In a climate where it's really, really beautiful outside, 4 to 5 months, but freezing cold the other 6 to 5 months, or 6 to 7 months, people stay indoors. They're not cleaning their houses. They're not remodeling as much. Construction isn't happening. And so we realized after about 9 months in the roll-off segment that this wasn't going to work. We couldn't pay our bills during the winter. And we weren't busy enough during the summer, because we were a new business, to be able to save up enough in the summer so that we could survive the winter months. So come 9 months, November, December, we quickly came to this realization. Again, looking back, it should have been so obvious. And we determined we got to get into weekly garbage service. We don't have a choice, otherwise we're going to be bankrupt because the roll-off industry, as I said, isn't busy enough during the winter to survive. And so now we were faced with another scenario of we got to buy another truck, a garbage truck, because a roll-off truck is very different than your weekly garbage truck that picks up the garbage, just picks up those dumpsters and drops them off. And going into that segment is a whole nother range of issues. What are you going to do with the recycling? What are you going to do with the trash? Who's going to drive the truck? Now, mind you, in this industry, you have to have a CDL, what's called a commercial driver's license. That was something that was new to us, but we had at least recognized once we bought these assets that you needed a commercial driver's license. So we were the ones driving the roll-off truck between, really it was Joe to start, and we'll talk about how that changed and our first hire, but we had recognized you needed a CDL. So going into the residential services side, we at least had that covered, but there are a whole other slew of considerations. And of course, a whole new area that needs money. More trucks, more maintenance, and you've got to buy the canisters that you give to every house that they put their trash in every single week. And those things aren't cheap, about $60 to $65 per can, depending on the size. At least they were at that time. So we were in for a long ride. We'll continue in future episodes how we made it through, some of the struggles that we went through because of our woefully inadequate assessments prior to getting into this industry, prior to starting a business. But we made it. Here we are today. So let's shift and let's talk about the considerations and the assessments that you should make, you should be thinking about when you want to start a business, or you want to grow a business, or you want to buy a business, or you're in business and it's not so fun because it's hard. As I said, our society, as I said in the previous podcast, you'll watch a documentary and of the most successful and well-known entrepreneurs, and it looks so easy, it looks so idyllic, and the reality is it's not. And as we talk over the next 10 to 15 minutes about these assessments, I don't want it to seem as though these are harsh realities or that these are negative assessments. But being honest and thinking about these considerations that we're about to talk about is really healthy in the sense that it will prevent you from future struggle down the road. So let's take a step back and talk about an entrepreneur, a business owner, running something, being responsible for something. In my experience, and in my belief, there are 4 different types of individuals. There are people who are born to be entrepreneurs, and there are people who are not born to be entrepreneurs. So start with those 2 categories. You always hear the question, is entrepreneurship something that is learned, or are you born an entrepreneur? Having started well over 5 or 6 businesses, having been around entrepreneurship for going on the better part of 20 years now, having talked with many, many people, both within business ownership, entrepreneurship, and within the corporate world, I believe, and nothing is ever black and white, but for purposes of this conversation, I think it's helpful to divide it into these categorizations. I believe that you're born an entrepreneur. If you don't have that internal motivation and that you're in that internal drive to be an entrepreneur or to run something or to take the risk that's required, and we'll talk about risk tolerances, which are so important, then you probably don't have it. Now, that's not to say that you can't learn business, and that's not to say that nobody's an entrepreneur, and that's not to say that everybody's an entrepreneur. So the 2 categories, I believe you're either born an entrepreneur or you're not. Within those categories, let's say you're born an entrepreneur. There are 2 additional ways in which I break it down. I believe there are those who are born an entrepreneur and they try being an entrepreneur, they start a business, or they get high enough in an organization where they're responsible for a division, and they work to satisfy that propensity of owning a business. And there are people who are born to be an entrepreneur who never give themselves the opportunity to even try. We'll return to that group in a moment. Let's take the other side of the coin. Those who are not born to be an entrepreneur. That category is further broken down into those who try to be an entrepreneur and fail because they weren't born to be an entrepreneur, and those who don't try to be an entrepreneur because they know they're not an entrepreneur and they're very happy with a consistent, stable income, working for someone else, helping someone else's business perhaps succeed, and they're perfectly content and they enjoy life that way. That category of people is so important and crucial to society. And we often tend to think in our society that, oh boy, being an entrepreneur is great and again, so idyllic. Well, the reality is it's a lot of work and there's a lot of struggle and it's not for everybody. But entrepreneurship and businesses would not exist, period, if you didn't have people that are happy and know that they like the stability of not being an entrepreneur. They like the lack of volatility. So society is so incredibly dependent on those who don't want to be entrepreneurs and that enjoy working for other individuals. And so my point in saying that is, thank you. I wouldn't have ever been successful in anything had there not been individuals who didn't want to be an entrepreneur. They were born to be an entrepreneur, or they were not born to be an entrepreneur, and they're happy not being an entrepreneur. The category I want to focus on is those who are born to be an entrepreneur, but they never give themselves the opportunity to even try. To me, that is, out of all of those four categories, the saddest scenario. And the scenario that if you fall into that category and you don't ever give yourself the opportunity to try to be an entrepreneur, I believe out of all of those four categories, you will have the biggest level of regret. The alternative to that is, let's say you're not born to be an entrepreneur and you work and you start a business and you fail. What's wrong with that? You tried and it didn't work out and you found that out. I believe you will have far less regret in that scenario than if you are meant to be an entrepreneur and you never give yourself the opportunity to try. Now, when people hear me say that you're either born to be an entrepreneur or you're not, they often think, boy, well, that's kind of negative, or that's not an optimistic way to look at it. On the contrary, because how can you know if you were born to be an entrepreneur or not if you don't think about that, if you don't take an honest assessment of that? You might think you're not an entrepreneur, and so you fall into the category where you're not born an entrepreneur, but you try it and realize, you know what? Actually, I enjoy this. I enjoy this lifestyle. I am an entrepreneur. And you don't know until you try. Now, that's not exactly true, but let's just say you don't know until you try. Some people do know. My point in saying all of this is when you're thinking about being a business owner and you're thinking about going into entrepreneurship, you could hear from me that, oh, everybody should be an entrepreneur and you're going to be really successful and things are going to be great and everybody should do it, but I'd be lying to you. And there's a lot of euphoria in our society of everybody should try it. But if you want an experienced opinion, an honest opinion, an approach that's going to give you the most opportunity to be successful and realistic before you go down the path of ordering assets and not knowing where to put them and not knowing how to generate revenue and being put in the position within 9 months of realizing, boy, we need $100,000 of more money that we don't have because the segment that we just got into doesn't have enough revenue to sustain for the 12 months out of the year, then you want to be taking an honest assessment in advance. So, this is meant to be a very optimistic but realistic conversation to help build a solid foundation upon which to have success in business. So let's say you're thinking about this and you have determined that you believe that you are an entrepreneur. You want to give it a try. I think it's also important for you to ask those around you, those who know you best, whether they believe that you're an entrepreneur. What does that mean, being an entrepreneur? I think you have to think about the commitment that it requires, mentally, physically, the sacrifice that it's going to require. Again, mentally, physically, in your external environment. And these are considerations that need to be made. I want to back up because I'm not sure that I've made the delineation as we've gone down this path of things to think about or considerations to make when you're thinking about starting a business. And again, this is just as relevant in year 5 of an existing business, year 10 of an existing business, because sometimes you start something and your life is miserable, regardless of whether the business is successful or not. Year 5, you realize, this isn't for me. I hate this. And maybe even if the business is wildly successful in year 5, and typically you don't have a business that's wildly successful when the individual in charge of the business or the department absolutely hates it. And if it is successful for other reasons, the propensity or likelihood that that's going to decline because there isn't a motivation or there isn't an enthusiasm to have it be successful or continue to be successful is relatively high, that it will go on the decline. So there are internal assessments that need to be made and external assessments. Right now, we're focusing on the internal assessments. I'm thinking about starting a business. Am I capable? Is it something that I want to do? Step number 1, let's say that you fall into the category of, yep, I believe I'm born an entrepreneur. I have a relatively high risk tolerance. I recognize that there's going to be a tremendous amount of volatility. Now, we knew that there was going to be volatility, but it's one thing thinking you know what the volatility is going to be like, and then it's another thing actually experiencing the volatility of being a business owner and an entrepreneur. And that's, again, a big reason why I started this podcast, is because year 2 or 3 of the business, I felt like nobody knew what I was going through, and nobody could relate to the true life experiences that I was going through. And this podcast is meant to ensure nobody feels that way, because we're a collective group of individuals that are going through similar struggles. Or talking about successes, talking about how we got through things. So going back to the internal assessments and external assessments. We're not going to talk much about the external assessments today that I believe that need to be made when you're thinking about this. For the internal assessments, we've already talked about you fall into the category of you believe you're an entrepreneur. One of the things that I have learned, and again, I've started many businesses. I've started a garbage company. I've started a construction company. I've started a manufacturing company. I've started an investment company. I've started this podcast. I've started a high wood furniture company, and that's one that I'm currently operating and working to grow. I've done this many, many times, and I want you to be able to benefit from all of the mistakes that I made and to have the opportunity to think about all the considerations that I never did, because that ended up in a lot of pain or a lot of hardship that I could have otherwise prevented had I just thought, 5 steps ahead, 10 steps ahead, instead of just jumping right into the pond. One of the things I'm going to be launching probably at the end of February is a member exclusive area on my website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, that will give you a number of surveys and additional content related to starting a business and taking an internal assessment. And am I an entrepreneur? Am I not an entrepreneur? things we haven't talked about, which are industries that you may want to go into, what are required in particular industries, what industry should you go into, what business should you start. It's going to be a whole resource area exclusively for members, and there's going to be a premium, probably $10 a month, less than 30 cents a day, that you can take and utilize to go through some of the things that we're talking about. Of course, no assessment on earth can tell you whether you're going to be successful in business or not, whether you are an entrepreneur or not. Nothing. If anybody says they have the perfect answer, or they can tell you, they're wrong and they're lying to you. But there are resources that can be helpful in doing so. So going back to the internal assessments, one of the things that's so important to know is the commitment that it's going to take if you're starting a business from scratch to be successful. We know the statistics. 20% of businesses fail within the first year, 50% fail within the first 5 years, and about 65% fail within the first 10 years. And it might be plus or minus percentages, but those are the commonly most recent statistics. You can go and research them pretty much anywhere on the internet. So you should be ready. And this goes whether you're starting a new business from scratch, which is oftentimes much more challenging than just buying a business, depending on what you're buying. You should be committing a minimum of 5 years. So ask yourself where you are in your stage in life. Are you ready to commit at a minimum 5 years to making this successful? Are the people that are important in your life, your spouse, your significant other, your friends, your family members, the entire support system that you're going to need to survive? And I can tell you, hands down, had I not had my family throughout a lot of this to be there to help with so many things that came up that were unexpected, I would have failed. So if you think you're going to be able to be a business owner or be an entrepreneur or run a division of an organization without a support system, without your family or a group of friends, whoever make up your support system, you're woefully lying to yourself, because it's not human. It's almost not possible. You will need a shoulder to lean on, and you will need help at some point in any business. Quite frankly, that's true for life. Every human needs other humans to be successful, either personally or professionally. So, are you and those around you ready to make a minimum of a 5-year commitment? Now, it might not take 5 years for you to be successful, but if you're going off of statistics and you want to go eyes wide open, you should be ready to commit 5 years to whatever industry or business you're in or working to get into or looking to start. If you're not willing to commit 5 years and the people around you aren't willing to commit 5 years, then you should take a step back and say, okay, is this really for me? And then I think the last thing from an internal assessment perspective is think of the hardest thing you've ever gone through in life. And think about having to do that again and again and again, multiple times. And is that something that you can withstand? Now, I'm going to caveat that with there are some things in life that are far harder than anything you will ever experience in business. So if, for example, you have had the death of an important family member or of a child or something of that nature, exclude that from this consideration. The point is think about the time you had one of the biggest struggles and how did you get through it? Who was there to help you get through it? And what type of grit was required to get through that particular circumstance? Now, this can be personal or professional. Often the ones that hit closest to home are personal. Why do I ask this? Because the number one thing it takes to be successful in a business is grit. And that grit primarily comes from one area right up here. You have to be capable of working on you and getting through some of the biggest challenges. When I think about who I am today and the experiences and how they've shaped me, I have matured and developed so much mentally and gained so much more emotional control over this, what we call emotional intelligence or EQ, because of all the hardships that you go through. But truth be told, knowing what I know now, and this is the beauty about youth and naivete, I don't know if I could go back and do what I did over again. Of course, I know the outcome, and it was a very positive outcome, and so it's easy to say yes, but really mentally, at my age, 36, could I do what I did again in my 20s? Probably not. Probably not. Physically, I don't think I could. Physically, I know I couldn't. Mentally, I'd probably be better off, but physically, I wouldn't be able to. So that's another consideration. And that's more of an external assessment, but physically, are you capable of what you're trying to do? So let's simplify this. We've talked a lot about taking a self-assessment, an honest self-assessment, internal assessment of, so you're thinking of starting a business. Is that right for me? And what are the considerations I need to make? There are probably 15 other things we have not talked about yet. But this is a very, very serious step to take. This is really something that's important to think about. And again, if you're in business right now, taking a step back and thinking through these things are just as helpful in year 5 or 10. One of the things that Jeff and I realized year probably 6 or 7 is we had gotten into an industry that we really hated. Now, I'm glad we got into that industry, and there's a lot of good things specifically about that industry from a financial model and from a revenue model perspective. But we hated so many things about the industry. How capital intensive it was, how labor intensive it was. It was exclusively, you couldn't grow the business without additional human capital. And it's not always easy, particularly in this day and age, to find employees that want to get up at 5 a.m. every day, want to pick up people's garbage, and want to continue doing so for years on end. And I could go down the list of why there were a lot of things that we just didn't really like the industry. The reason it's important to take this assessment periodically is because we didn't really do that. Now, I'm not sure that we really had a choice to make any change regardless of what the assessment said, but it's often helpful in driving the direction of where you want to go. What I mean by that is it's helpful to take an assessment and say, you know what? I'm not having fun, and I don't like this industry. Why? Are there things that I can change? Or are these things inherently that I can't change? And so if I continue down this path, I'm going to see myself in 5 to 10 years, and maybe I'm wildly successful financially speaking, but personally I'm miserable. And I'll say one thing, and it's absolutely true. Money doesn't make you happy. And there are a lot of people think that money makes you happy. We have so many examples in society where that just isn't the case. And my life experiences are a huge indication to me of that's not the case. Now, a certain level of money is important to provide for your family, to have a sustainable lifestyle, to have fun from time to time. But all the studies show after a certain amount of money, it doesn't make you any happier. Some of the wealthiest people in our society kill themselves. And we see that on a daily basis. If money made you happy, why would you do that? Because money doesn't make you happy. And so the point there is, had we taken this assessment, probably year 7 or 8 of the business, a real honest assessment about why were we struggling to take the next step, or why were we struggling to commit, it would have been helpful for us. Would it have changed the outcome? I don't know. It very well could have. But since we didn't do it, I'm not certain. My point in saying this is whether you're starting a new business or your existing business, taking these steps back and thinking about internal assessments about your willingness to continue, your grit, what is the impact it's having on your mental health, on your physical health. Those are important to being successful in business. We haven't talked about any of the external assessments. Okay, so you want to start a business. How much money are you going to need? What industry do you want to go in? What are your skill sets? What are your strengths? Where aren't your skills and your strengths? And how are you going to fill that gap in the business, either by hiring outside professionals or bringing on a business partner? We will get to that in another episode of this podcast. So to wrap our conversation today up, taking an honest assessment of who you are, whether you're an entrepreneur or not, whether becoming a business owner or starting a business or buying a business is right for you, all depends upon looking at some of the key things that you know or that we've talked about that are important to ultimately being successful. Are you an entrepreneur or are you not an entrepreneur? A lot of times you won't know until you try. There are people out there that do know that they're not entrepreneurs and they like a stable lifestyle and they're happy working for a paycheck every week or every other week. And I'm thankful for that group of individuals because no business would succeed unless if we had that group of individuals in society. But let's say you're someone that does, as I realized when I was growing up, have the propensity to be an entrepreneur or believe you have the propensity and you want to start something. Not because society glamorizes it and you can get filthy rich and all of the positive things and it can happen overnight, because all of that is not true. Yes, you can get wealthy. That doesn't mean you're going to be happy. No, it never happens overnight. At least anything that has real long-term value doesn't happen overnight. And yes, it's a lot of work and there are a lot of sacrifices and it's a big struggle. But on balance, for me, absolutely it's worth it. I would do it again. Could I physically do it again? I'm not sure if I could at this age. But I've got a lot of other companies that I've started, and I would start them again given the opportunity again. Even for some of the things that failed, I probably would, because I wouldn't be who I am today, and I wouldn't know what I know today had I not had those failures. So, if you have questions about anything that we talked about today, and you're doing an internal assessment, and you're not sure what the answer is, reach out to me. Shoot me an email. Ask me a question. Hey, I'm thinking about starting a business. I'm taking the assessment or really trying to take an honest approach to, is this something I want? But I'm stuck on this particular point, or I'm not sure about this, or perhaps the people around me have these questions, or I'm committed to 5 years, but my spouse or significant other or my family isn't committed for 5 years. What should I do? Reach out to me. We can have those conversations. That's what this podcast is for. If there's questions you want me to answer on the next podcast, let me know. Because there's nothing better than having a large support system where you can ask a question or ask me to ask a question. I can ask a question and ask you, our listeners and viewers, to answer it. What have your experiences have been? What have your self-assessments been that you've taken? Where do you wish you would have taken a step back and asked particular questions? And that's what this is for. Because if we have these conversations, if we support each other, if we are open, vulnerable, honest about what it really takes to be successful, the probability of being successful is far higher. The probability of getting yourself in a scenario where that was easily preventable, that's extremely difficult, is less likely. So reach out. Ask me those questions. Ask me to ask those questions of our viewers. If you have viewpoints or things that you think we missed, that you think we should be considering based on your experiences, let me know. We'll talk about them in future podcasts. That's all for today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast. If you prefer prefer to view our podcasts. Even if you don't, you'll get notifications when new ones have been posted. Follow me on Twitter, A Holland Podcast. That's where I talk about conversations and things outside of the podcast. Feel free to tweet towards me and I will respond. I try to be as interactive as possible. And of course, visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content for all of our podcasts and to reach out and ask questions of me, ask me to talk about certain things, or inform me of things that you think are important that we talk about. Thanks so much for joining us today for episode 2 of the Andrew Holland Podcast. Have a great week, and we'll talk again. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.